in listening to Donald Trump, Yamiche, it sounds like he's setting us up for the idea, and Garrett may have some more detail on it, that he's not planning to make a deal as things stand with Democrats because he's not budging on his wall.
It's hard not to see that we're either edging closer and closer to declaring a national emergency, and that's what the president will do, or we're going to end up back in another shutdown, because Speaker Nancy Pelosi said today, no matter what happens, there will be no wall funding in the negotiations. And the president just said everyone's wasting their time if they don't come up with wall funding. So that means that if the president doesn't get his way, he said basically, I'm not going to read the report or even talk about the deal because I didn't get my way. So I don't see a way out of this. He's backed himself into this corner, 35 days, 3 weeks, and we might still be getting the national emergency that he could have declared in December.
Do you think he would read the report if there was wall funding? Don't answer that. Garrett Haake, President tweeted this earlier. Well, this morning he was tweeting about sending
15 times today already.
But this morning he was tweeting about sending more troops to the border. Obviously, that would support Yamiche's idea that he's getting us closer to this idea that a national emergency is what's going to be called for. But we're a day after we saw intelligence chiefs not mention the border wall until, like
page 18 or something like it. It was well in there. But Garrett, is there, I think I saw Democrats saying they'll consider any option on the table. Is a wall any part of this consideration?
It's not yet, and it probably won't be. If we're talking about a four-letter word, a concrete wall like the president has been talking about, I hold in my hands the Democrats' opening offer here on this committee. And not only is there no money in it for a wall, a fence, or a barrier, none of those words even appear in it. The only mention of the word barrier is a list of places explicitly where it would be prohibited from being built. Now, there's lots of money in this for other priorities on border security, including things like $675 million for ports of entry inspection technology. They do boost up the amount of money being spent at the border, but there is nothing here as we start this process for a wall or a border fence or a barrier. But I have to tell you, the conversation around Capitol Hill, you've heard a little bit of loosening from Democrats on the idea of a fence or something like that where it's appropriate. But they really want to make Republicans prove a need and a specific need. They're not going to approve a pot of money that the president can build wherever he wants. But it might come down to something like, okay, if the Republicans can prove there's a specific need for 20 miles of wall somewhere in Arizona or 20 miles of fence, and it would probably have to be described that way, that could be the kind of thing that ends up in this negotiation, but it's certainly not where this thing is starting. Which,
by the way, both sides, and when I say both sides, I don't mean the president, have said over and over, we need fencing, we need a complicated security system. But, Yamiche, the president has said that the wall is being built. What exactly is he talking about?
It's hard to tell because the president is saying that there's a wall being built, and we know that that's demonstratively false. What we do know is that there's probably repairs being made to the existing fence, and there's probably things that are going to be happening on the border, just making sure that they're being repaired, making sure that they're up to date, which is in some ways probably standard repairs. But the president has said this. The Republican leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy, has also said the wall is being built. Both of those things are completely not true. What we know is that the president said at one point that he was going to go to a groundbreaking before the State of the Union for the wall. That didn't happen either. So I think the president here is just trying to tell people, or maybe put it in the air, that this wall that he wants is really the existing fence that was put up by administrations before him.
Yeah, he's tweeted, he's made reference to the parts of it are being built in two specific tweets today, and he said it again in that conversation. Garrett, some Democrats, like Senator Chris Coons, are starting to seem a little more at ease with allowing, as you said, some talk about a fence in part of the final proposal to the president. What's the sense of where that fits into the discussion? Are Democrats sort of saying, all right, I'll give you some kind of a barrier, but we're not getting much money for it?
Because we do need security.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see Democrats coming to the table and saying, hey, why not build a wall or a barrier in this particular place? But I am hearing more of that kind of language, like what Chris Coons is saying about if Republicans can demonstrate a specific need to build a specific barrier in a specific place, Democrats could conceivably go for it. It's been really interesting to hear. I think it's one of the Democratic talking points. They're saying we want to do fact-based border security. They do not want to write a blank check for some kind of barrier. But if there can be a demonstrated need, they might go for that. And you even heard some of that in Nancy Pelosi's press conference today. And I'm going to tee up this soundbite. I hope we still have it, in which she dismisses more or less outright the idea of a wall, and then talks a little bit more open-mindedly about a fence if it's what her negotiators think is necessary. Take a listen.
There's not going to be any wall money in the legislation. Is there a place where enhanced fencing, Normandy fencing, would work? Let them have that discussion.
So those comments were made minutes apart in the same press conference, and we get once again into this semantic trap about what's a wall, what's a fence. Now we're talking about Normandy barriers. What would be actually necessary in specific places along the U.S. border could still be built. But the idea of some big expansive wall, like the president keeps talking about, is just not on the table. And Democrats, remind you, control that committee. They have one additional vote on that committee. So nothing's getting out of that committee if Democrats hold the line and say they're not building it.
Okay, well, before we go then, Yamiche, let's talk about the committee, because the president is not on it. Do you have any sense of where the two sides are?
I think that the two sides are, Republicans want some sort of win for the president here because they understand that even if the president isn't directly involved, and I've talked to White House officials, they say that the president isn't going to really be trying to insert himself too much into that committee. They need to be able to tell the president, we got some sort of a wall for you, even if it's a smart wall, maybe it's drones, maybe it's technology, where the president can say we have a 21st century wall. On the Democratic side, they are trying to hold the line in that not only do they not want to give the president a win, but on the Democratic side and the Democratic base, they have no interest in giving a wall to the president when 2 years of a House that was controlled by Republicans didn't give him that. So I think there is, of course, some overlap on this idea of border security, on the need for humanitarian assistance on the border. It's definitely true that there are more unaccompanied minors coming across the border. There are more family units coming across the border. So that's definitely something that they agree on. But when it comes to this border wall, it seems as though both sides understand that that's not going to happen. And as Garrett said, it's just not even on the table that a long concrete 2,000-mile wall is going to be built. Now, the president's kind of backed up and said, well, maybe just a couple hundred miles, please. And even then, Nancy Pelosi has seemed to say you can't have that either.
February 15th is the day we're all looking to.
Ali, can I make a comment on that, on the date part of this? Because the president kept saying this too, February 15th, February 15th. This conference committee, if they're going to get anything actually passed, they've got to get to a deal before then. And the date that's been talked about up here is next Friday, the 8th. We'll know what they've agreed on or not in a week from tomorrow. So there's there's going to be that week here for the president to decide whether he's going to read that report or not before the government runs out of money. But I think the date to really circle is February 8th. Because that's when this committee has to figure something out if they really want a chance to actually get it to the president's desk on time.
Next Friday as opposed to the 15th, which is the following Friday. All right, we'll be keeping... Garrett, you would expect, knows all these dates, right? All of his vacation and time off is based around whether the government gets its votes done. Good to see you both. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.